The taste of mercy. The snow had been falling for 3 days when the first delivery truck arrived at Camp McCoy, its exhaust trailing white against the gray Wisconsin sky. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face to the barracks window, watching guards unload wooden crates with an efficiency that reminded him of loading ammunition back home. He had been captured 4 months ago during the retreat from the Pacific Islands, and everything in this place, the geometric precision of the fence posts, the scheduled meal bells, even the way snow collected in perfect drifts, felt like a careful mockery of order. The other prisoners gathered around him, their breath fogging the glass. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, the unofficial leader among them, muttered something about American logistics. They had grown accustomed to the thin soup, the hard bread, the portions that kept them alive but never satisfied. Yamamoto touched the letter in his pocket, the one from his sister describing rationing back home, how their mother saved rice grains like pearls. What none of them expected was the smell. It drifted across the yard that evening, rich and yeasty, carrying notes of butter that made Yamamoto's stomach clench with something beyond hunger. Through the mess hall windows, they could see guards preparing something different. The usual steel pots had been replaced with flat iron surfaces that hissed and spattered. An older guard, the one they called Miller because of the flour always dusting his sleeves, was shaping patties of meat with his bare hands, whistling a tune that carried across the cold air. Private Kenji Sato, barely 19 and trembling from more than just the Wisconsin cold, pressed closer to the window. "What are they making, Lieutenant?" Yamamoto had no answer. The meat patties were larger than anything he had seen in 2 years of war, thick and marbled with fat that would have fed his entire family for days. Miller worked with casual abundance, seasoning each portion as if the camp stores were inexhaustible. The first twist came during evening roll call. Instead of dismissing them to barracks, Camp Commandant Patterson announced that tomorrow's meal would be in the American style. Yamamoto translated for the others, but the words felt strange in Japanese. What was American style? The prisoners had been taught that Americans were soft, spoiled by abundance while their own people sacrificed for the emperor. Yet these guards worked through the cold, their hands cracked from winter duty, their own uniforms patched and worn. That night, Yamamoto lay awake, listening to Tanaka recite quietly to himself, not prayers but military codes, fragments of orders, anything to maintain the rigid structure that had sustained him through surrender. In the bunk below, Kenji whimpered in his sleep, calling for his mother. The boy was 19 and had never tasted anything but rice, vegetables, and the occasional piece of fish. Through the thin walls, Yamamoto could hear guards talking in the next building. Their voices carried exhaustion, worry about brothers and sons fighting somewhere in the Pacific. One mentioned receiving a letter about rationing starting back in Ohio, sugar becoming scarce. The contradiction gnawed at him. These men spoke of shortages at home while preparing feasts for their prisoners. At dawn, the second twist arrived with breakfast. Instead of the usual watery porridge, each prisoner received a thick slice of bread, not the dense, dark loaf they had grown accustomed to, but something pale and soft that yielded under their fingers. Butter, real butter, sat melting in small pats that caught the light from the mess hall windows. Kenji stared at his portion as if it might dissolve. Several prisoners looked to Tanaka for guidance, but the sergeant's face had gone carefully blank. Yamamoto took the first bite and felt his composure crack. The butter was rich beyond anything he had tasted in 2 years of war. The bread sweet and yielding in a way that reminded him of festival cakes his grandmother made when he was small. Around him, other prisoners began eating with desperate silence, some weeping quietly as they chewed. It was Miller who had prepared this, the same guard who had shouted at them during work detail, who checked their barracks for contraband, who represented everything they had been taught to resist. Dr. Sarah Chen entered the mess hall during the meal, making her morning rounds. The camp physician spoke to them in careful Japanese learned from textbooks, checking for signs of illness or distress. She paused at Yamamoto's table, noting how his hands shook as he buttered his second slice of bread. "Better color today," she said simply, making notes in her ledger, but Yamamoto caught her studying them with something beyond professional interest, as if trying to reconcile their humanity with whatever stories she had been told about Japanese soldiers. The morning brought work detail in the camp kitchen, and Yamamoto found himself assigned to help Miller prepare lunch. The guard worked in silence initially, pointing to tasks, washing vegetables, sorting potatoes, scrubbing enormous pans. But as the morning progressed, Miller began humming again, occasionally offering corrections in broken Japanese. "No, no, like this," Miller said, showing Yamamoto how to properly season the meat patties. "For flavor, yes?" The casual instruction felt like betrayal and gift simultaneously. Here was enemy knowledge freely shared, techniques that would serve Yamamoto well if he ever cooked again in peacetime. If peacetime ever came. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. The routine of abundance began to reshape their days at Camp McCoy with unsettling efficiency. Each morning brought fresh milk so cold it made their teeth ache, accompanied by eggs, actual eggs, not the powdered substitute they had expected. Yamamoto watched Kenji discover his first taste of American coffee, the boy's face cycling through confusion, distaste, then reluctant appreciation as sugar transformed the bitter liquid into something approaching pleasure. Sergeant Tanaka maintained his discipline through morning calisthenics, leading the prisoners in exercises designed to preserve their strength and, more importantly, their identity as Imperial soldiers. But even Tanaka could not ignore the way flesh was returning to their faces, how the Wisconsin winter no longer seemed quite so penetrating when their stomachs were full. "We must not become soft," Tanaka whispered to Yamamoto during their work detail in the camp laundry. "They want us grateful, dependent." Yet Yamamoto noticed how Tanaka saved half his breakfast bread each morning, wrapping it carefully in cloth. Was he hoarding it for leaner days, or had he begun to treasure the texture, the way butter soaked into the soft crumb? The camp's daily rhythm revealed itself through sounds that became familiar. Miller's whistling as he prepared meals, the rumble of supply trucks arriving twice weekly, Dr. Chen's soft footsteps during her rounds. Camp McCoy operated with a mechanical precision that somehow accommodated small kindnesses, extra blankets distributed before storms, hot soup available for night guards, prisoners excused from outdoor work when the Wisconsin wind turned brutal. It was during one such storm that Yamamoto encountered the first bottles. Miller emerged from the camp store carrying cases of glass containers filled with dark, effervescent liquid. "Coca-Cola," he explained in his broken Japanese, grinning at their expressions as each prisoner received one with lunch. The first taste made several prisoners spit in shock. The liquid fizzed and stung their tongues with aggressive sweetness. Nothing like the subtle flavors they had known, but others, Kenji among them, drank deeply, their eyes closing in something that looked dangerously like pleasure. "It's like drinking celebration," Kenji whispered to Yamamoto, unable to hide his wonder. That afternoon, Dr. Chen conducted her weekly medical examinations in the camp infirmary. She worked methodically, checking weight gain, examining skin condition, testing reflexes. When she reached Yamamoto, her touch was clinical but gentle. "You are healing well," she said in her careful Japanese. "The nutrition is helping." Through the window, they could see local farmers arriving with wagons full of vegetables, carrots still crusted with Wisconsin soil, potatoes larger than Yamamoto's fist, onions that would have been treasures in any Japanese market. The abundance seemed inexplicable, almost aggressive in its generosity. "Doctor," Yamamoto ventured, "why do they feed us so well? We are enemies." Dr. Chen paused, considering her words. You are far from home. Sick men cannot work. And the Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of prisoners, but her explanation felt incomplete. Yamamoto sensed something else behind the careful meals, the medical attention, the way guards sometimes shared cigarettes or showed photographs of their own families. The treaty might require adequate food, but it did not mandate fresh milk and Coca-Cola. The third twist came through Father Morrison, a local chaplain who visited monthly. A thin man with kind eyes, he brought candy for anyone who wanted it, peppermints that dissolved slowly on the tongue, chocolate that melted in their pockets. He asked no questions about faith or loyalty, simply offered what comfort he could. "You boys are a long way from home," Morrison said to Yamamoto one afternoon. "That's suffering enough for anyone to bear." Through Father Morrison, they learned that the local farming community had voted to supplement the prisoners' rations with surplus produce. Families whose sons were fighting somewhere in the Pacific had decided that enemy soldiers deserved basic humanity. The contradiction felt overwhelming, parents grieving their own children while ensuring enemy soldiers ate well. The psychological pressure intensified with each passing week. Letters from home arrived sporadically, describing increasing desperation. Cities burning, rations cut again, families fleeing toward the countryside. Yamamoto's sister wrote of eating bark soup, of watching their mother grow thin from giving her portions to the children. Yet here, Yamamoto found himself gaining weight, his face fuller than it had been since before the war began. When he looked in the small mirror Dr. Chen provided for shaving, he saw a man who appeared healthier than many guards, better fed than the farmers who donated vegetables. The camp library, small but well-stocked, became another source of confusion. Father Morrison had convinced the commandant to provide books in multiple languages, including Japanese texts on philosophy and poetry. Yamamoto found himself reading Basho's haiku about snow, while actual Wisconsin snow fell outside, the irony not lost on him that enemy captivity had returned him to the literature of home. During one evening meal, beef stew with vegetables served with fresh bread and butter, Kenji began asking dangerous questions. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "if our enemies care for us better than our own officers did, what does that mean? What were we really fighting for?" Tanaka ordered him to be silent, but other prisoners had begun voicing similar doubts. The abundance at Camp McCoy was creating fissures in certainties that had seemed absolute. How could they explain to families back home that kindness from American hands had taught them more about dignity than years of military discipline? The evening brought news from the Pacific Front through guards' conversations overheard in the kitchen. Islands falling, supply lines severed, entire divisions missing. But at Camp McCoy, the supplies continued arriving, the meals remained generous, and guards continued treating prisoners according to regulations that seemed to value human life above strategic advantage. Yamamoto lay awake that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the barracks, quiet breathing, occasional nightmares, Tanaka's whispered recitations of military protocol. Outside, Wisconsin wind howled across the prairies, but inside they were warm, fed, and safe. The weight of that safety felt heavier than chains. March brought the first hints of spring to Camp McCoy, and with it an intensification of the psychological battles that had begun to define daily life for the Japanese prisoners. The snow melted in patches across the Wisconsin plains, revealing earth that would soon support the abundant crops that supplemented their meals. Yamamoto watched the changing season with growing unease, knowing that each day of health and safety deepened the contradiction he would eventually have to carry home. The delivery trucks now arrived with even greater frequency, bringing not just basic supplies, but luxuries that defied explanation. Fresh fruit appeared at breakfast, oranges and apples that reminded Yamamoto of New Year celebrations from his childhood, when such treats were reserved for the most important occasions. Miller peeled oranges with casual efficiency, distributing segments as if vitamin C were as common as water. Sergeant Tanaka's resistance had grown more desperate and more futile with each passing week. He organized evening discussions about duty and honor, reminding the prisoners of their obligations to the emperor and the shame of survival through capture. But his words competed against the memory of fresh bread, the taste of real coffee, the warmth of adequate clothing. "We are being corrupted," Tanaka insisted during one such gathering. "They want us to forget who we are, to become grateful for our chains." Yet even as he spoke, Yamamoto noticed how Tanaka had learned to fold his blankets in the American style, how he unconsciously hummed tunes he had heard Miller whistling. The corruption, if that was the right word, was working in both directions. Dr. Chen's medical examinations revealed the full scope of their physical transformation. Weight gain was universal among the prisoners. Their complexions improved, their energy restored. But she also noted signs of psychological strain, insomnia, anxiety, what she carefully documented as adjustment difficulties related to cognitive dissonance. "You are conflicted," she observed to Yamamoto during one examination. "This is normal. War creates impossible situations." Her clinical assessment felt both accurate and inadequate. How could medical terminology capture the weight of receiving kindness from those he had been taught to hate? How could charts and measurements account for the shame of health while his family starved? The arrival of packages from Japanese-American families in Chicago created another layer of complexity. Father Morrison had arranged for local Nisei communities to send care packages, carefully inspected but genuinely generous. Tea that tasted like home, rice crackers, even small bottles of soy sauce that transformed the camp's American meals into something approaching familiar flavors. "These families have sons fighting for America," Morrison explained to Yamamoto, "but they remember what it means to be far from home." The irony was staggering. Japanese-American soldiers were fighting against Japan while their families sent comfort to Japanese prisoners. War had scrambled loyalties and identities until simple categories of enemy and friend became meaningless. Letters from home grew increasingly desperate. Yamamoto's sister wrote about their neighborhood in Tokyo, how entire blocks had been reduced to ash, how children fought over scraps of food. She begged for any news of his treatment, hoping he was being kept alive for eventual repatriation. He could not write back truthfully. How could he explain that he had gained weight while she grew thin, that enemy soldiers ensured his health while imperial forces had often treated their own men as expendable? The truth felt like betrayal of everyone he had left behind. The camp's work details had evolved into something approaching job training. Yamamoto was now trusted with significant responsibilities in the kitchen, learning techniques and recipes that represented genuine skills. Miller had begun teaching him English culinary terms, creating informal lessons that felt more like friendship than indoctrination. "Good cook you become," Miller said one afternoon, tasting Yamamoto's attempt at American-style vegetable soup. "Maybe after war, yes?" The assumption that there would be an after-war, that Yamamoto would survive to use these skills in peacetime, struck him as both hopeful and presumptuous. Miller spoke as if Yamamoto's future mattered, as if enemy soldiers deserved to plan beyond the immediate requirements of survival. It was during one of these kitchen lessons that Yamamoto overheard the conversation that would change everything. Miller was talking to another guard about his son, missing somewhere in the Pacific, captured or killed. Nobody knew for certain. 19 years old, Miller said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a father's grief. "Same as some of these boys we got here." Yamamoto's hands stilled in the soapy water where he was washing dishes. Miller had been preparing their meals with the same care he might have hoped someone showed his missing son. The hamburgers, the fresh bread, the patient cooking lessons, all were expressions of hope that humanity might persist, even between enemies. The revelation recontextualized everything. The abundance at Camp McCoy was not propaganda or strategy, but something simpler and more complex. The insistence that young men remained human beings regardless of the uniforms they wore or the flags they served. That evening, Yamamoto tried to write a letter to his sister, but found words failing him. How could he describe the taste of fresh butter when she was eating bark soup? How could he explain that enemy kindness had begun to feel more real than homeland ideology? The conflict intensified when news arrived of major defeats in the Pacific. Islands lost, fleets destroyed, entire armies cut off from supply lines. Yet at Camp McCoy, the routine continued unchanged. Generous meals, medical care, even entertainment, as spring weather allowed for outdoor recreational activities. Kenji approached Yamamoto after evening roll call, his young face marked by confusion and guilt. "Lieutenant, do you think we're becoming traitors by accepting all this? By feeling grateful?" Yamamoto had no answer that would satisfy either of them. Gratitude felt like betrayal, but hatred had become increasingly difficult to sustain against daily evidence of genuine care. The spring planting season brought new work details, opportunities to labor alongside local farmers, who treated the prisoners as temporary help rather than dangerous enemies. They worked Wisconsin soil that would produce the vegetables they would later eat, participating in the cycle of abundance that sustained their captivity. Standing in fields that stretched toward the horizon under an enormous Midwestern sky, Yamamoto felt the full weight of contradiction. This land, these people, this careful attention to prisoner welfare, all represented everything he had been taught to despise about American softness and decadence. Instead, he found a different kind of strength, one that insisted on dignity even for enemies, that maintained humanity even in the midst of total war. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The Wisconsin spring of 1945 brought work details that would fundamentally alter Yamamoto's understanding of both war and peace. As the ground thawed and farmers began preparing fields around Camp McCoy, prisoners were assigned to agricultural work that took them beyond the familiar boundaries of barbed wire and guard towers. For the first time since capture, they could see the horizon without obstruction, breathe air that carried the scent of growing things rather than disinfectant and regulation. Yamamoto found himself assigned to the Brennan farm, 3 miles from camp, where an elderly German immigrant named Klaus worked land that had fed 3 generations of his family. Klaus spoke little English and less Japanese, but he communicated through gesture and example, showing the prisoners how Wisconsin's soil responded to careful cultivation. The first day brought another revelation about American abundance. Klaus provided lunch for the work crew, thick sandwiches made with fresh bread, sliced ham that was tender and well-seasoned, pickles that added sharp contrast to the rich meat. He served this meal as if feeding prisoners were simply another farm chore, necessary and unremarkable. "Good workers deserve good food," Klaus explained through one of the guards who spoke German. "This is how we do things here." Sergeant Tanaka worked alongside them but maintained his rigid disapproval, accepting food only after ensuring that refusal would create more problems than compliance. He ate mechanically, as if each bite were a tactical decision rather than nourishment. "We must not let comfort make us forget our duty," Tanaka reminded Yamamoto during their walk back to camp. "This abundance is not meant for us." But Yamamoto had begun to question what their duty actually required. Were they obligated to refuse kindness that helped them survive until repatriation? Was gratitude truly betrayal, or was it simply human recognition of genuine care? The answer came through Dr. Chen, whose evening medical rounds had evolved into informal counseling sessions. She understood better than most the psychological pressure facing the prisoners. the impossible balance between survival and loyalty. "Accepting food does not make you less Japanese," she told Yamamoto during one examination. "Staying alive is not surrender of principle." Her words carried personal weight. As a Chinese-American physician, Dr. Chen understood the complexity of divided loyalties, the difficulty of maintaining identity while adapting to circumstances. She had chosen to serve America while honoring her heritage, finding a path between competing demands that offered some hope for others facing similar conflicts. The foreshadowed intervention came through Father Morrison's monthly visit, but this time he brought a guest, Rebecca Miller, the cook's 12-year-old daughter. Miller had requested permission for his daughter to visit the camp, hoping that seeing faces rather than just hearing stories might help her understand why he spent so much care on prisoner meals. Rebecca approached the task with the directness of childhood, offering sticks of gum and asking questions that adults would have considered impolite. "Do you miss your families?" she asked Yamamoto through Father Morrison's translation. "My dad misses my brother, Tommy. He's missing somewhere in the Pacific." The connection was immediate and devastating. Rebecca's brother was likely fighting against Japanese forces while her father fed Japanese prisoners. Yet the family had chosen care over vengeance, humanity over hatred. Rebecca distributed photograph postcards of Wisconsin landmarks, lakes, farms, small towns that looked peaceful and prosperous even in wartime. The images showed a country that seemed impossibly wealthy and generous, where abundance was normal rather than exceptional. "This is where you are now," she said simply. "Maybe it helps to know what home looks like here." That evening, Yamamoto studied the postcards by lamplight, trying to reconcile these images with everything he had been taught about American decadence and moral weakness. The farms looked well tended. The towns appeared stable and caring. If this was decadence, it was a form that produced remarkable generosity toward enemies. Work details continued through the spring, and with them came deeper relationships with local farmers who treated prisoners as temporary neighbors rather than dangerous captives. The Brennan farm became a laboratory for cross-cultural understanding, where Klaus taught Japanese techniques for rice cultivation while learning Japanese methods for maximizing small plot yields. The exchange felt genuinely valuable on both sides. Wisconsin could grow rice with proper technique, while Japanese agricultural knowledge could improve vegetable production in similar climates. War had brought together farming traditions that might otherwise never have met. Dr. Chen documented these interactions in her medical reports, noting improved morale among prisoners who engaged in meaningful work. But she also observed increasing anxiety among those who felt most conflicted about adapting to American ways. "The mind needs purpose as much as the body needs food," she explained to Yamamoto. "Work that matters helps both." Her words proved prophetic when news arrived of Germany's surrender in Europe. The war was ending by pieces, and with each development, questions about repatriation became more urgent. What kind of Japan would they return to? How would they explain their experiences to families who had sacrificed everything for victory? The Hamburg steak served that evening, ground beef shaped into patties and served with gravy and mashed potatoes, represented everything complex about their situation. The meal was generous, expertly prepared, and genuinely satisfying. It was also completely foreign to their experience, a comfort that belonged to enemy culture. Kenji ate with tears streaming down his face, no longer able to hide his confusion and gratitude. Other prisoners watched him, with expressions ranging from sympathy to disapproval, each man wrestling with his own response to unprecedented kindness. "I don't want to go home if it means forgetting this," Kenji whispered to Yamamoto. "How can I pretend none of this happened?" The question haunted the barracks that night. Returning home would require a careful accounting of their time in captivity, explanations for their survival and health. The truth, that enemy care had saved them, might be impossible to tell without seeming to dishonor everyone who had not been so fortunate. Miller appeared in the kitchen early the next morning, beginning preparations for another day's meals with the same careful attention he had shown for months. He worked steadily, seasoning meat with practiced efficiency, preparing vegetables with respect for their freshness and quality. Watching him work, Yamamoto understood that this was how peace might actually function, not through grand gestures or political agreements, but through daily choices to treat other human beings with dignity, regardless of the circumstances that brought them together. The Hamburg steak had become more than a meal. It was an argument for the possibility of civilization persisting even when civilization appeared to be destroying itself. The central secret of Camp McCoy revealed itself through a folder accidentally left on Dr. Chen's desk during a routine medical examination in late April 1945. Yamamoto, waiting alone in the infirmary while she stepped away to retrieve medical supplies, found himself staring at documents marked Prisoner Nutrition Study in English and Chinese characters. The papers detailed everything: calorie counts, vitamin supplements, protein requirements carefully calculated to restore health to malnourished prisoners. But more shocking were the comparative charts showing mortality rates at other camps, testimonials from repatriated prisoners about their treatment, and recommendations for post-war medical care that assumed many prisoners would return home bearing witness to American policies. Dr. Chen returned to find Yamamoto reading, his hands trembling as he turned pages that revealed the systematic nature of their care. She did not take the folder away immediately. "You understand now," she said quietly in her careful Japanese. This was never about kindness alone. The documents revealed what Yamamoto had begun to suspect, that Camp McCoy was an experiment in humane treatment, a deliberate demonstration of American values designed to create exactly the kind of testimony that prisoner repatriation would inevitably produce. Every hamburger, every glass of Coca-Cola, every medical examination had been carefully planned to ensure that Japanese soldiers returned home with stories that would contradict their homeland's propaganda about American brutality. But the revelation carried a deeper complexity. The care was real, the medical attention genuine, the food actually nourishing. The experiment succeeded not through deception, but through authentic implementation of humanitarian principles. American propaganda was proving itself through practice rather than promises. "Were we being manipulated?" Yamamoto asked. Dr. Chen considered her answer carefully. "You were being cared for according to our best understanding of medical needs and human dignity. That this care serves political purposes does not make it less real." She showed him additional documents, letters from American families whose sons were missing in the Pacific, all expressing hope that enemy soldiers would treat prisoners with similar humanity. The Coca-Cola, the fresh bread, the patient medical attention, these were not calculating strategies, but expressions of values that Americans hoped would be reciprocated. The Hamburg steak that had confused and comforted them for months suddenly took on new meaning. It was simultaneously a gift and a message, nourishment and testimony, genuine care and strategic communication. Miller prepared these meals with real concern for prisoners' welfare, while knowing that every bite would become part of the story they carried home. That evening's meal felt different with this knowledge. The meat was just as tender, the vegetables equally fresh, but Yamamoto tasted intention in every bite. He was consuming an argument about American civilization, taking in evidence that would eventually require response. Sergeant Tanaka noticed the change immediately. "What happened today? You look like a man who has seen ghosts." Yamamoto could not share what he had learned without involving Dr. Chen in possible security violations. Instead, he asked a different question. "Sergeant, what will you tell your family about the food here?" Tanaka's face tightened. I will tell them what they need to hear to understand that we remained faithful Japanese soldiers despite enemy attempts to corrupt us. And if they ask specifically about our health, about why we survived when so many others did not, I will say we were strong, that our spirit sustained us. But Yamamoto knew that their families would see the evidence of care in their faces, their restored weight, their healthy complexions. The truth would be visible regardless of the stories they chose to tell. The psychological pressure intensified as spring advanced towards summer and rumors of total surrender grew stronger. News from the Pacific described an empire collapsing, cities destroyed, armies scattered. Yet at Camp McCoy, the meals continued unchanged, the medical care remained consistent, and guards prepared for prisoner repatriation with the same systematic efficiency they had shown throughout captivity. Father Morrison's next visit brought news that local farmers wanted to host a harvest celebration, including the prisoners who had worked their fields through the spring planting season. Klaus Brennan specifically requested Yamamoto's participation, crediting Japanese techniques with improving his crop yields. "You have contributed to this community," Morrison explained. "It would be wrong not to acknowledge that contribution." The invitation represented another impossible choice. Accepting would mean participating in enemy festivities, celebrating abundance that had been built partly through their labor. Refusing would reject genuine gratitude from people who had shown them consistent kindness. Kenji had no such hesitation. "I want to go," he announced. "I want to see what celebration looks like in America." His words carried the weight of cultural curiosity that transcended political loyalty. Kenji was 19 years old and had never seen abundance celebrated rather than hoarded, generosity displayed without strategic purpose. The Harvest Festival offered education in a form of civilization he had never experienced. Dr. Chen supported the participation from a medical perspective. "Community celebration supports psychological health," she noted. "Isolation serves no therapeutic purpose." The festival itself became another revelation. Held on Klaus Brennan's farm on a warm Wisconsin evening, it brought together farming families, camp guards, and prisoners in an atmosphere that seemed to temporarily suspend the categories of war. Children played games that crossed language barriers. Women shared recipes through gesture and laughter. Men discussed agricultural techniques with the intensity of craftsmen comparing professional methods. The Hamburg steak reappeared as the centerpiece of the celebration, but now Yamamoto understood its full significance. Miller had taught several local cooks his techniques for preparing the dish, creating a shared culinary language that connected American abundance with the prisoners' experiences of enemy care. Rebecca Miller approached Yamamoto during the feast, carrying a bottle of Coca-Cola and wearing the serious expression of a child with important business. "My dad says you helped him learn to cook better," she said through Father Morrison's translation. "He says teaching makes the food more special." The statement captured something essential about their entire experience at Camp McCoy. The abundance had been made meaningful through sharing. The care had gained power through reciprocity. Even in captivity, human connection had created value that transcended the circumstances that made it possible. Standing in a Wisconsin farmyard under stars that looked the same as those over Japan, eating food prepared by enemy hands with techniques he had helped refine, Yamamoto felt the full weight of what he would carry home. Not just testimony about American treatment of prisoners, but evidence of a different way of understanding civilization itself. The secret was not that they had been manipulated, but that they had been invited into a demonstration of values that sustained themselves through practice rather than force. The news came through official channels on August 15, 1945, carried by a radio transmission that crackled through the Camp McCoy administration building with words that would end everything and change nothing. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and formal, announced surrender to Allied forces and instructed all Japanese military personnel to lay down their arms. Yamamoto sat in the mess hall, where he had first tasted Hamburg steak, surrounded by prisoners who received the news with expressions ranging from relief to devastation. Sergeant Tanaka's face had gone completely blank, as if his mind refused to process information that invalidated every assumption that had sustained him through years of war. The first twist came with realization that surrender brought not freedom, but a new form of waiting. Repatriation would take months to organize, transportation to arrange, documentation to complete. Camp McCoy would remain their home through the summer and into autumn, extending their experience of enemy care into a post-war world where such kindness would become even more difficult to explain. Miller continued preparing meals with the same systematic attention he had shown throughout their captivity, but now his work carried different meaning. The Hamburg steak served that evening was not prisoner ration, but hospitality extended to former enemies who were becoming something more complex. Guests, students, witnesses to American values in practice. Dr. Chen's medical examinations took on new urgency as she prepared documentation for prisoner repatriation. Each man's health would be officially recorded, creating permanent testimony to their treatment at Camp McCoy. Weight gain, improved dental health, successful treatment of minor ailments, all would become part of the historical record. "You will carry these documents home," she explained to Yamamoto, "medical proof of how you were treated here." The papers felt heavier than their actual weight suggested. Official documentation of enemy care would create questions that simple stories might avoid. Families would want to understand how prisoners had gained weight while the homeland starved, how enemy doctors had provided better medical attention than imperial military physicians. Father Morrison organized a farewell gathering that brought together prisoners, guards, and local farming families for a final shared meal. The setting, Klaus Brennan's farmhouse decorated with late summer flowers, created an atmosphere more suited to family reunion than prisoner repatriation. Rebecca Miller, now 13 and more confident in her interactions with the former prisoners, presented each man with a small gift. Packets of vegetable seeds saved from the harvest they had helped produce. Corn, tomatoes, squash varieties adapted to Midwestern growing conditions but potentially successful in Japanese soil. "So you can grow American food in Japan," she explained through Father Morrison's translation, "and remember what we shared here." The gifts represented another impossible complexity. Taking the seeds meant carrying enemy agriculture home, introducing foreign techniques that might improve Japanese farming. But accepting them also meant acknowledging that something valuable had been learned from captors, that enemy knowledge deserved preservation and application. Kenji accepted his packet with tears streaming down his face, no longer ashamed of emotions that had become too strong for concealment. "I will plant these and tell my children about the girl who gave them to me," he promised. The second twist came through Klaus Brennan's request to employ several prisoners as farm workers until repatriation ships became available. The proposal, approved by camp administration and prisoner consent, meant that some men would spend their final months in America as paid agricultural laborers rather than military captives. Yamamoto chose to participate, partly from curiosity about American farming techniques, partly from reluctance to end an experience that had fundamentally altered his understanding of both war and peace. Working for wages rather than under guard created yet another category of existence, neither prisoner nor citizen, but something unprecedented in his experience. The psychological weight of this choice became apparent in Tanaka's response. The sergeant opted to remain at Camp McCoy under traditional prisoner status, maintaining military discipline and formal distance from captors. He could not accept transformation of the relationship, even when circumstances made such change inevitable. "We cannot become Americans," Tanaka warned Yamamoto. "Do not let their kindness make you forget who you are." But Yamamoto's identity had already evolved beyond simple categories. He was Japanese, but also someone who had learned to prepare American food, who understood Wisconsin farming techniques, who had experienced abundance shared freely between former enemies. Return to Japan would require integration of these experiences into a self-understanding that could accommodate contradiction. The final twist revealed itself through a letter from Miller's wife, written to the prisoners in careful English with Father Morrison providing translation. She thanked them for working alongside her husband in the camp kitchen, crediting their assistance with making his service more meaningful during their son's absence in the Pacific. "Tommy is coming home too," she wrote. "Wounded, but alive. Perhaps someday you can meet as men at peace instead of soldiers at war." The possibility of peacetime meeting felt both fantastic and inevitable. If former enemies could work together in Wisconsin farmyards, if children could share seeds across cultural boundaries, if medical care could flow freely regardless of nationality, then perhaps war's divisions were less permanent than they appeared. The repatriation ships arrived in October, carrying prisoners from camps across the American Midwest toward a Japan they had not seen for years. Yamamoto packed carefully, ensuring that medical documents, vegetable seeds, and a few photographs from the Harvest Festival were secure among his possessions. The last meal at Camp McCoy featured Hamburg steak, prepared according to the techniques Yamamoto had helped refine, served with vegetables grown partly through Japanese agricultural methods, accompanied by Coca-Cola that had become familiar rather than foreign. Miller served the meal personally, shaking hands with each prisoner before they departed. "Good luck," he said in his broken Japanese. "Remember us kindly." The return journey to Japan revealed a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, entire social structures collapsed. The abundance of Camp McCoy appeared almost mythological against landscapes marked by desperate poverty and systematic destruction. Yamamoto's family greeted his return with joy, complicated by visible evidence of his health and weight. His sister's first question, spoken quietly while examining his face, carried all the complexity he had anticipated. "How did you survive so well when so many others did not?" He told them about the food, the medical care, the farming work that had sustained him through captivity. But he found himself unable to convey the full emotional weight of enemy kindness, the way American care had challenged everything he had believed about war and civilization. Years later, writing to his own son about the war years, Yamamoto would struggle to explain those months in Wisconsin. "How do you describe that sometimes the most devastating weapon is unexpected mercy, that being fed by enemy hands can undo certainties that seemed absolute?" The memory of Miller's careful preparation of meals, the taste of fresh bread and Coca-Cola, the sound of laughter echoing across snowy farmyards, these had quietly changed everything. He planted Rebecca Miller's seeds in a small garden behind their rebuilt home in Tokyo, watching American vegetables grow in Japanese soil. The corn never quite adapted to local conditions, but the tomatoes thrived, producing fruit that carried the taste of Wisconsin summer into a homeland, learning to imagine peace. The Hamburg steak never appeared on their family table. The ingredients remained too expensive, the techniques too foreign for regular use. But Yamamoto taught his son the method Miller had shown him, ensuring that knowledge born from enemy kindness would survive into a generation that might never understand the context that made such learning possible. Sometimes, late at night when memory grew strongest, Yamamoto could still taste the rich sweetness of Coca-Cola, still feel the satisfaction of fresh bread dissolving on his tongue. These sensations carried weight beyond nostalgia. They were proof that humanity could persist even when humanity seemed impossible, that small acts of care could outlast the hatred that made them necessary. The true victory of Camp McCoy was not political or strategic, but simply human. The demonstration that enemies could choose to see each other as people, that abundance shared freely created bonds stronger than the forces that had divided them. In a world learning to imagine peace, such knowledge felt both precious and essential, a taste of mercy that would season every meal that followed. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.